All right, welcome everybody to the Friends of the Cabildo lecture series. I hope you've taken advantage of some of our lectures, which have been all over the place of Louisiana and Southern history, New Orleans history, on kudzu, among others. Um, and next week we're going to be talking about the golden age of department stores on Canal Street with Mickey Pfeffer, talking about places like D.H. Holmes and Maison Blanche. So I hope you'll tune in 2 weeks on April 30th. And then on May 7th, we're going to be talking about the Po' Boy with Burke Besh Bershoff. But tonight's lecture is when I saw this lecture, I was like, I need to know more. I've always heard a lot of stories about this man, and I'm just excited to have more to learn more. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Eric Criss. He's the author of The Boss of New Orleans, Martin Behrman, and the Machine Politics in the Crescent City. I want to welcome Dr. Criss, and thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I'm really excited to talk to everyone a little bit about the book and about Behrman in particular. I don't know how you guys usually like to do this, but I thought I would just sort of talk about the Behrman's importance, his relevance, why I wrote about him. And then just sort of walk through the book a little bit by walking through the stages of his life, and maybe do some Q&A if that's convenient.
Yeah, we'll have some Q&A afterwards. And if you
Okay.
have questions, put them in the chat. If not, I'll ask a couple questions at the end. So yeah, go ahead. That's exactly the layout we're looking for.
That's great. That's great. And if folks are interested, I'll read a passage as well. But really, to begin with, so Behrman is important sort of broadly to, I think, everyone, and to New Orleans and to the state, because he is one of the chief architects of modern New Orleans, certainly New Orleans in the 20th century. One of the things that happened after Reconstruction, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, really across the South, was that the cities were quite devastated. Of course, the countryside was too, but the cities in particular were often had open sewers. Disease was a real problem. It was difficult to envision building the cities on the foundation that they had. They were quite poverty-stricken too, in terms of the money that just was an outflow during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And so Behrman came along at a time when the right person, obviously working with a lot of other people, could do things like lead the paving of streets and help to eradicate yellow fever, which killed thousands of people every summer, and contribute to the building of schools and drainage. He's really the screw pumps that have become so infamous in New Orleans were designed and constructed on his watch. So that's the relevance of Behrman from a practical standpoint to the city of New Orleans. To me in particular, I found Behrman a fascinating study. I was originally looking for a way to write about Prohibition and the Prohibition era that was sort of new and fresh. There have been many books written about Prohibition and alcohol. And so as I was researching Prohibition, I obviously prostitution was closely connected to many of the problems with alcohol, and then ultimately to the implementation of Prohibition. And prostitution led me to Storyville, and then Storyville led me to Behrman. And what I discovered as I studied Behrman more in depth is that he was not only really at the crossroads of that debate about Storyville and alcohol and prostitution, but really the entire reform movement in the South, and that New Orleans was at the center of the progressive debate across the entire country. There have been some historians who hope to or tend to underestimate Southern progressivism, and in fact, the opposite is true. There was a vibrant progressive movement in the South. It was a unique brand of progressivism. For example, most of the progressives in the South, although they supported giving women the right to vote, they did not support giving blacks the right to vote. So, for example, they supported a state amendment to allow women to vote and women only. But they did not support a national amendment. Generally speaking, they did not support a national amendment for women's suffrage because they believed that would also give black women and ultimately blacks the right to vote. So those were the types of things that attracted me to Behrman as a point of study. I'll talk a little bit about Behrman himself, and I think the easiest way to think about Behrman, because there was so much happening in this historic period of U.S. history and New Orleans history, that in my mind, I like to divide his life up into sort of three stages, and that would be his early childhood and Reconstruction in the South. That was a period when he lost both of his parents. He was orphaned as a young man at 13, 12 actually, and there were many orphans actually at the time in New Orleans, often due to parents dying from yellow fever and other diseases. But Behrman was a 12-year-old on his own who made his way with the help of friends and people who were kind to him. And he really came of age during Reconstruction, an era of dramatic political violence in New Orleans, where blacks and whites were battling for political power. And he survived that, survived yellow fever and the death of his parents. And so he was certainly a fighter and a survivor. And then the next sort of major period of his life is early career. And that is an era, a period of his life that I think about the reemergence of the reform movement, which had stalled mostly during the Civil War. And then his time as a political volunteer, acting as a ward leader and holding some small local political offices. He was a really hard worker. He drew notice and praise for being such a hard worker, and was steadily promoted. I think that early career period, when I think of it for him, I think of it as him really earning a reputation as someone who was a straight shooter and a hard worker, and that elevated him. That was also an important time because after Reconstruction, the solidarity among whites who had previously unified to keep the blacks out of power, the solidarity eroded quickly once the local folks were in control and were able to disenfranchise blacks. There was really no reason, for lack of a better phrase, for all the white politically active types in the community to stick together. And so there was a split. There was sort of the machine which Behrman became part of, and that is often referred to as the regulars. and later it went by different names. The Ring, the Old Regulars. That group was not liked by the reformers. There were some scandals, some political scandals in the 1890s. Behrman was still a very young man and not part of those scandals, but the regulars, the machine in New Orleans, sort of began quickly to earn a reputation for corruption. And the reformers, who were more the business elites and the economic elites among white Democrats, took on the machine in election after election in a pattern that really stayed true all the way into the 1920s and the rise of Huey Long. But it's an interesting point to emphasize that there was not a cabal among New Orleans Democrats. There was actually a fair amount of division between those sort of uptown elite business reform types and then the reform types that Behrman and the regulars represented as part of the political machine in New Orleans. And that was a myth that Huey Long and later some historians promoted. And it was very much part of Huey's populist message, but it's a fallacy. And so as Behrman, as the 1890s wrapped up and the 20th century began, Behrman's reputation for honesty and hard work got him selected to run for state auditor. And he won and moved his family to Baton Rouge. And then very shortly thereafter, I mean, within months, the New Orleans machine asked him to come back and run for mayor. He had uncovered some improprieties in the way the state was keeping books. And the machine wanted a guy with a reputation for honesty and hard work. And they particularly needed that on the heels of the scandals of the 1890s. And so Behrman did accept that position. His wife did not want him to, but they did it, and they moved back to New Orleans. And then he kept that job as mayor of New Orleans and won 4 elections in a row. And so that was sort of his early to mid-career period. And then later in his career, which is sort of the last part of it, is really when the implementation of prohibition and the closure of the Navy, the threatened closure of the Navy Yard and the closure of Storyville, a chapter that really led to his loss in 1920 when he was defeated by the reformers. And that was his only loss in running for mayor. And later, he was elected again as mayor in 1925. That is also a period that was I associate with the rise of Huey Long. So you're getting into the 1920s there, and Huey. Obviously, we all know Huey, and he's quite the character. And I talked a lot about Huey in the book because he was a sharp contrast to Behrman, really in every way. Behrman was a deal maker, and he worked with the progressive New Orleans business community as often and as much as he could, although he was head of the machine and mayor. And so I think that Behrman's sort of hard work and ability to make a deal and compromise and reputation as a progressive leader and really as a kind person and a family man in so many ways stood in contrast to Huey. And so that's sort of a summary of the book. just a couple of insights that for anyone interested in reading the book. We it talks a lot about the convergence of reform, particularly alcohol reform, and fears about prostitution and human smuggling, and how that fed into the closure of Storyville. The book goes into a little bit of New Orleans beer history. There's a fascinating fun fact that I was not aware of, but until I researched the book, but that the first refrigerated brewery, machine refrigerated brewery, was actually in New Orleans. Lager beer, which was gaining popularity, requires a certain temperature. And a guy named George Mertz first tried shipping ice from the Great Lakes area to brew lager beer, and that didn't work. There were a lot of reasons that ice houses were unpopular even in the North. They were particularly ineffective in the South. So George Mertz used a commercial refrigeration machine in a brewery for the first time in the United States, right there in New Orleans. It was called the Old Canal Steam Brewery. So there's a lot about alcohol in the book. At the time, I was president of a group in Florida, a trade association called the Beer Industry of Florida, and I was particularly interested in the beer history part of all this. I was also interested in the sort of political philosophy part of the whole Behrman and Huey dynamic, and I think people have a hard time when we use terms like progressive and conservative and Democrat and Republican in the 21st century, because those terms were so different and so much more broad, particularly the term progressive in the early 20th century. Progressive back then really wasn't what many of us think of on the political spectrum as a progressive today. So in the book, I sort of define those terms up front, and then talk about them in more detail. But that's sort of an overview of the book. There's some interesting tidbits about the Navy Yard and how and why it closed. There's the history of the Navy Yard in New Orleans was long and interesting. It sat empty and idle for a long, long time. And then in the early 20th century, as Teddy Roosevelt became president and the U.S. really looked to expand and get involved in the Pacific Ocean and the Philippines, and all of the whole nature of warfare and navies changed. That contributed to the emergence of the Navy Yard in New Orleans. And then as hostilities in Europe increased and the Panama Canal opened, it became really a critical port. So let's see. I saw a question: would you define progressive? I did. It kind of went away before I could see the whole question. Yeah. So I'll talk about maybe what a progressive was in the.
Hey, I can read it, Eric. Would you please define progressive and reformers as they were used in the early 20th century? I can't wait until I read your book for the definition.
Oh, yes, thank you. So progressivism was an interesting movement in the early 20th century. It's a broad and it's a term that's really too broad to be accurate for the 20th century. So when we think of, I'll give you an example. When we think of the progressive movement today, we do not think of evangelical Christians, right? But evangelical Christians were certainly part of the progressive movement in the 20th century. It was a very fractured movement. So progressives were seen as, for example, someone who might be for prohibition. They might be for new labor laws. They were considered to be, in one respect or another, forward-thinking. Progressives were thought to be anti-war, but in fact, there's a few pages in the book about the divide in the progressive movement prior to World War One and leading up to World War One. Some progressives, Herbert Crowley, for example, and others, saw the U.S. entering World War One as a way to spread progressive values around the world in a sort of evangelical way almost. And then there were other progressives who were, adamantly anti-war and I mean, just passionately anti-war. So there were deep divides in the progressive movement, and it was extremely fractured in the early 20th century. Whereas, if I were to take a stab at defining it today, I would say it's more homogeneous. The political agenda of the progressive movement today is pretty clearly defined, and there might be some disagreement among progressives about certain aspects, but you don't find such a wide divergence. I don't think so. And you had progressives. I'll give you another great example locally in New Orleans. There were progressives who were very involved in the labor movement, supporting and protecting women factory workers, even things like animal shelters and all kind of wonderful things, medicines, orphanages, but they didn't support the right of blacks to vote, and were outraged when Teddy Roosevelt had Booker T. Washington to the White House for lunch. So I think those kind of divisions make that progressive was maybe just, you could think of it as forward thinking. And I'm sorry, I know that's a long answer, but it's not an easy answer.
Eric, did you mention what he did in his career before he became mayor, and then what did he do in between his 4 terms, and then he came back again? What did he do for a job?
Yeah, so I'll go backwards from I'll start with that last part of that question. So he became vice president at a bank, and I can't recall the name of the bank off the top of my head. But that's actually an interesting period because he continued to run the machine, both formally and informally. And even when he wasn't mayor, was sort of seen as one of the people standing between Huey Long and kind of the peasants with pitchforks descending on New Orleans. And if folks are interested, I'm happy to read. There's actually a passage that I marked that I was going to read.
Sure, go for it.
That talks about that kind of tension between he and Huey. And I'll finish answering your question before I do that. But so he was vice president of the bank, and he was still running the regular political machine in New Orleans. And then that's part of what made his comeback easy. And by the way, Huey very much did not want Behrman to get elected in 1925 because it was the New Orleans machine that helped to defeat him in his first gubernatorial bid. And Huey feared that if Behrman got back in control of New Orleans and the regular machine got back in control of New Orleans, that he could not get enough. He didn't need to win New Orleans, but he needed to get a chunk of vote in New Orleans. And so Huey very actively organized against Behrman when Behrman ran that last time in 1925. but to go back earlier, what were some of his jobs? So he had some interesting jobs. He was on the political side. He ran the uh, he ran the he organized Algiers politically. So he was the ward boss for Algiers, and then he was a volunteer fireman. And there's a story where he talks about what he saw in the big Algiers fire in the 1890s, and a picture of him in his firefighter's uniform as a very young man. Um, that was really an era when the great fires across the country were happening, and it was feared as much or more than hurricanes or earthquakes or anything else. Um, and and then his career was in the grocery business early in his career, and he worked for several grocers. And as an orphan, it was one of those grocers who took him in and really helped him to survive. And next door to that home where he lived, uh, there was a family that was close uh, to them, and that's how he ultimately met his wife, Julia Collins. She was down to visit with the next door neighbors, and but there's a lot of interesting pieces about that grocery business and how he got to know everybody in Algiers. Um, he eventually went into business himself for some time, and he and a partner opened a grocery store in the Algiers post office. And so, which is kind of a novel business idea, right? You have to come and get your mail, so why not buy some groceries while you're here? But it really helped him get to know everybody in Algiers. And then he also took the census, not necessarily to make money, but because he basically knocked on everybody's door in Algiers and knew everything you could possibly know about Algiers by being the census taker, which I just found fascinating. And it kind of feeds into this idea that nobody was going to outwork Martin Behrman. So, and then politically, he had some jobs. He was on the school board, and he was a deputy auditor for a time, so it's kind of a deputy treasurer for the city council. And then he volunteered for a couple of gubernatorial campaigns, and sort of earned his reputation that way. But those were the kind of things he did early in his career. But I'll circle back now to the Huey Long piece, because it's just fun, to be honest. And it's relevant, right? Because I mean, if you have to wonder, if Behrman had not died early, and if the regular machine had lasted a little while longer, how would that have changed the arc of Huey's career? And there's no sense in trying to predict that, but certainly the local New Orleans press viewed Behrman and the regulars as the muscle who could potentially stop Huey. So I'll do some paraphrasing here, but I'm looking at page 170 of the book, and it talks about when the feud between Behrman and Huey erupted into a real war at the Democratic State Convention in 1924. So what they had done, before I read, I'll give you a little more background. What they typically did was the political elites gathered prior to the state convention and privately divided up the at-large delegates to the Democratic National Convention, and that's how they determined who got to go to the Democratic National Convention. And so I'll read now. When Huey Long heard the news, He used the opportunity to burnish his upstart credentials. Why should the rejects have all of these places? Asked Huey. Historian T. Harry Williams, who published a biography of Long in 1969, described the tense atmosphere, the chatter, and the chaos that erupted at the state convention. And so now this is T. Harry Williams, not me, writing. Behrman called the meeting to order and was elected permanent chairman. Quickly, he announced that, hearing no objection, he would name Sanders, the former governor, as chairman of the former senator, as chairman of the resolutions committee. Just as quickly, Sanders moved that no resolutions be debated or voted or even read to the convention until they had been passed on by his committee. So that was their way of keeping people out of the Democratic National Convention, whom they did not want to go. And a voice from the rear of the hall interrupted the smooth flow of the proceedings. I object. It came from Huey, who rose from his seat and began to speak. A roar of boos and imprecations shook the building and continued for several minutes. Behrman pounded his gavel on the marble-topped table until he broke the marble. Finally, he quieted the bedlam sufficiently to announce that he was ruling Huey out of order. Huey, on his feet again, demanded a roll call vote. Behrman ruled against him. A Long supporter shouted, "Don't run the steamroller too fast over us." The calling of the roll on the motion to table consumed 25 minutes and was conducted in a continuous uproar. Finally, the result was announced: 536 votes to table and 180 votes against. And then it goes on a little bit, and it talks about the Huey's speech, and Huey referred to them as bosses and bosslets, the clicksters and the ringers who were contaminating democratic government in the state. And what was interesting about that is that afterwards, the New Orleans Item and the New Orleans Times-Picayune, who had skewered Behrman and the regulars back in 1920 because they wanted him out of office, were just full of praise for Behrman and the regulars after that convention. And they said that Huey was but chaff before the wind in front of Behrman. So that's kind of a little story about the conflict between Behrman and Huey, and about how at the end of his career, Behrman had really rehabilitated his reputation with the press and the reformers. And I'll go back when I use that term reformers, because it does, in the book, the way I define it is essentially the machine reformers, because they really did stand for many, many reforms. And then the sort of progressive uptown elite reformers. And I think in the book I called them anti-machine reformers. So it was kind of, machine reformers and anti-machine reformers, but they were all very much reformers in many ways. But those anti-machine reformers just hated Behrman for years and years, and said the worst, most awful things about how he was corrupting girls, and supported Storyville. And he did support Storyville for reasons I won't get into. There was a theory about containing prostitution that was popular even among many progressives in the early 20th century, and Behrman supported that idea. He eventually caved in to the Navy and closed Storyville, but the reformers, the anti-machine reformers, latched on to that and painted him as, this terrible wretch who was, for prostitution and young girls being sold into slavery. So the irony of that, of course, is is the way that the newspapers and the anti-machine reformers came around and really praised him near the end of his life, especially in light of his sort of building a bulwark, albeit temporary, against Huey. I saw the question, what did Behrman die from? His doctor, in sort of simple terms, said, I think in the interview in the newspaper after his death, it said, listen, I warned him to work less and to take it easy, and he didn't listen, and he never stopped working 20-hour days. He was known for his cigars, so that might have had something to do with it. But in a nutshell, it was heart disease. Myocarditis is I believe what was on his death certificate, and I'm not a physician, so I don't know the sort of, I can't explain it from a technical standpoint, but my read of it was heart disease. He was very overweight by the time he died, and he was never without a cigar. So I think those things contributed to his death.
All right. Well, I think that'll probably wrap us up for tonight. I will be sending out everybody a link to tonight's lecture who's not here, and then a link to the book. The book is out, right, Eric?
Yes. I'll give it I'll show the cover real quickly here. That's it. And yeah, I would love it if you buy the book. And if you've got any questions and you have you read the book and you want to ask any questions or any thoughts on the book, I'd love to have them. You can reach me at my email address, which is really simple. It's just well, I'm like most everybody, I have too many email addresses, but let's use ericcriss@yahoo.com. It's just ERICCRISS@yahoo.com. And please email me with any questions. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book. It's my first book, so hopefully, and I'll just give you one quick word of warning on this. It's not a popular history. It's written for graduate students, essentially. So if you're feeling that one particular part of a chapter drags or one part of the book doesn't interest you, if it gets too deep in the weeds, then keep reading. Just skim the boring parts and don't have any warm milk because it might put you to sleep. But skip around. There's a lot of fun stuff in there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and we hope to see everybody in 2 weeks for Mickey Pfeffer and learning about the Canal Street department stores. Eric, thank you so much. We appreciate you doing this tonight, and good luck on the book.
Thanks so much. I appreciate being here. Thanks
Great
for
talk.
the opportunity.
Thank you. Yep.
Bye-bye.